Welcome back to my channel once again. My name is Uche Wohiri, and this topic I have titled Context, which is simply understanding the brief in order to create the story world for an art director or a production designer. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now I'll start with the definition of the word context. And I have searched for a number of definitions, but I found something that perfectly suits the topic that we're going to discuss. And context here is simply defined as the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. And in our case, mirroring the art directing and creating a story world, context can be defined as understanding the parameters and boundaries within which to build the story world. Now, there are two important reasons for understanding this concept called context, and I'll list them out. Now, the first point I want to talk about is this: it guides the thought process. Understanding the context of the story enables the art director to think along the right lines in terms of introducing the right elements to the story in creating that story world. Knowing what the context is helps the thought process of the art director or the production designer in establishing what elements to introduce into creating that story world. And I'll give you an example. One of the elements of the context of the story is genre. And if the art director or the production designer understands what the genre is, this guides his or her thought process on what elements, what color palette, what features, what scale to introduce to that story. These are all factors and these are all elements that enable the art director to think right in the correct direction in terms of what to do in creating that story world. The second point is this: it helps in budget management for the art director or the production designer. And this is, it cannot be overemphasized. Constantly I've had conversations with people about, how to best manage the budget. There have been constraints and things like that. But I say to a lot of people that the first thing is understanding the context of the story world. If you do understand the context of the story world, you can manage things like scale, which, directly translate to quantities of materials and elements. Having conversations with certain people who influence and, make up the context of the story world will help you. For instance, if you're in a bus park and you talk to the executive producer about the scale of this story in terms of the size of the bus park, it enables you to understand how many buses you need to bring in there and get away with still creating the illusion of a busy bus park, as against struggling to channel your resources into the wrong direction. There might never be an inexhaustible supply of funds for any film. So one of the trainings that you should have as an art director or a production designer is to understand how best to manage your budget. And understanding the context of the story world will help you do that much better. There are three vital people who set up the context for the story world, and I've listed them out. The first person I would like to talk about is the producer. And because the producer is in control of the budget, the understanding of the entire process, the producer is a major influence on the context of the story. And so the art director or the production designer need to speak with the producer on knowing their boundaries and the parameters within which they're supposed to construct or create the story world. The second person is the director. And the director is the creative head of any production, whether it's music videos or short films or feature films or TV shows or television series. And so it is important for the production designer or the art director to have conversations with the director to understand the path he or she is going to take, to understand the nature of the story, to understand what he or she has in mind in terms of what kind of moods they want to portray per scene or generally. So he is or she is a major influence in setting the context for the story world. And the third, but not the least, is the writer. The writer writes the story. And because the writer writes the story, the writer is in the best position to understand the story world in terms of, certain aspects of it, like the era, the scale, the social level of the characters at play in the story and things like that. So these three people are influential in setting up the context for the story world. And these three people are people who the art director and the production designer should be talking to in order to get an accurate understanding of the context of the story world. There are certain features that best describe the context of the story world. And it's quite interesting because recently I went to give a little lecture to the students of the Ebony Live Creative Academy. And we collaborated on listing out the number of features. And I put together an interesting list. Thank you to the students. One of the features is genre. So of course the genre talks about what the mood is, whether it's a horror film, whether it's a children's show, whether it's a drama series, whether it's a thriller or it's an action series, and these will, influence what the story world should be. The second feature is the color palette, which is influenced in some way by the genre as well. The director might say, I want these three major colors and then certain complementary colors to just go as secondary colors in the story. And so that guides what type of elements that the art director is introducing to the place, what quantity, what proportions of colors, what ratios of, certain agreed colors to put into the story world. So colors is a feature. The third feature is, the format. Whether it's a feature, whether it's a short film, whether it's a TV commercial, and in other words, to determine how best to create that story world so quickly the people can understand what is being portrayed. Like with TV commercials, you need to understand, in 60 seconds. With TV series, the story is allowed to breathe and stretch out, and so there is the opportunity to lead the audience gradually along, and this influences how much you put in front of the camera, in the spaces and all those kind of things. The fourth and the fifth features, which I have decided to put together, are the budget and the scale of the story world. And you will agree with me that these sort of rub off each other, so with the budget that you understand that you have, it will influence how you create the scale, and of course the scale will be affected by how much resources you have to establish that look and that feel. Pre-production time can be considered as a feature as well that influences the context of the story. Like for instance, if you have a very short pre-production time, it will influence your decision making, whether to purchase props or rent props or build props. Those will be influenced by your pre-production time. Another feature is the culture and language. So this affects the tribe and this affects the look and the feel. There are certain, cultural elements that you would want to bring into your story world to immediately indicate where you are in terms of what tribe. And, I've done a number of commercials and, a lot of times the clients come in and say they want to do a commercial for the North in Nigeria. And so I immediately understand that there's certain elements that are indicative of the North certain classic elements that immediately point in that direction. So the culture and the tribe influence the way the story world is created. Another feature is the era, the time period. One of the shows that I worked on was DJ, and in episode 5, were supposed to create Enugu in 1991. And so it was important to establish immediately what era we were in. And there were certain features that were very popular in that time. There were certain architectural techniques that were used in that time. There were also certain colors that were very popular in that time as well. So all these elements had to be employed to immediately put people in that era and give them an understanding of where they are in terms of the time. There is the social economic dispensation, which is the class level of the characters at play in the story. So you will agree with me that a boy who comes from humble means, his dwelling place will be very different visually from that of a boy who comes from, comfortable means. And one of the projects that comes to mind is a short film that I worked on with Mr. Tolu Ajayi, and it was titled Special Day. And it just visually compared the lives of two young boys. One was a destitute and another was a boy living in a comfortable environment. And at some point in the story, they actually physically met each other. But there was a frame by frame, side by side comparison. And it showed very strongly the vast differences between these people and also consequently the opportunities that were available to them. But this also influenced the story worlds that I created for each of them. So the socio-economic dispensation of the characters involved is an essential feature in describing the context of the story world. The final feature that describes the context of a story world is a very interesting feature. Not everybody might agree, but it's also, effective. And that's government policies. And I'll give an example. One of the scenes in a show that I worked on had to do with a low-income, high-density area. And we were creating a food court or a food point, And one of the things that were popular at that time were styrofoam containers. But we realized at the time that we were making it that a new government policy had emerged that banned the use of these styrofoam containers. And so that influenced our decision on what kind of utensils and containers to be used for that scene, because it was time specific. So in that case, you'll have to agree with me that the government policy was an influence in the creation of or the context of the story world. Finally, I always advise art directors and production designers to watch a lot of films and TV shows. And there's some examples of films that are great examples of a specific understanding of the context of the story world. One of them is The Matrix. I mean, you can go and see it, and I feel that it's a great example of understanding the context, because in The Matrix, we understood that what human beings considered as the real world was actually a construct in their minds. And so because of that, there were certain things that became allowable when you understood the story world and the context of it. And because of that, there were elements that we saw that didn't seem out of place because the context had already been established and these elements were allowed in the context of that story world. Another example is Jumanji. And in Jumanji, we saw that the actors were transported into the game world. And because of the way the game world is created and runs, we understood certain elements that we saw at play. For instance, a person having life bars on his arms and falling out of the sky after he had been killed, coming back. It seemed okay because of the context of the story world that established that they were in a game and not the real world. That's all we have on this episode. If you feel inspired by any one of the points that I have raised, please share your comments in the comments section. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you on the next episode.